Hello students, I'm coming to you with the next video lecture on chapter 2, which is related to evidence-based practice. This is the first video lecture in this series. In terms of an overview of this lecture, we will begin by discussing the difference between evidence-based practice and the scientific method or the social work research process. I always like to begin here because what I find is that there are so many steps involved in each process. And although they are both very similar, there are some nuances and some distinctions that are important to establish from the beginning. So we will start here. Then we will discuss what is evidence-based practice. And I think this is necessary as well, because what I often find among students is that although we talk about evidence-based practice quite a bit in the social work profession, oftentimes students don't have a solid understanding of what we mean when we say evidence-based practice. So we'll also talk a little bit about that. Then we will talk about evidence-based practice and critical thinking. We will also talk about evidence-based practice in career-long learning. One of the things that we also talk about quite a bit in the social work profession is the importance of continuing education. And so we know that when we sign up to be a part of the social work profession, we also sign up to be lifelong or career-long learners. And so we'll talk about what that means within the context of EBP. And we will end this video lecture by talking about the steps in the evidence-based practice process. And within this video, we will just discuss steps 1 and 2. In terms of learning objectives, by the end of this video lecture, you should be able to define evidence-based practice, contrast evidence-based practice with practice based on tradition or authority, explain the connection between evidence-based practice and critical thinking, explain the connection between evidence-based practice and career-long learning, identify and describe steps 1 and 2 in the evidence-based practice process, formulate an answerable evidence-based practice question, identify the steps involved in conducting an effective search for evidence, explain the hierarchy of evidence used to distinguish between the best and most credible forms of evidence, and finally, describe and distinguish top-down and bottom-up search strategies, including their advantages and disadvantages. So we are still in Unit 1. In the last video lecture, we covered Chapter 1, which is Why Study Research. In this lecture, again, we will focus on Chapter 2, which covers evidence-based practice. And from there, we will move on to Chapter 3, which is related to factors influencing the research process. And there, we will primarily focus on how the application of theory influences the research process. And finally, in this unit, we will discuss Chapter 4, which is related to quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods of inquiry. So again, as I just mentioned, let's start by connecting some dots or talking about the evidence-based practice process in comparison to the scientific method or the social work research process. So as I mentioned previously, although there are some similarities between these two processes, it is very important to point out the differences as well. And so in the evidence-based practice process, I like to refer to this process as more of a consumer model, and I'll explain the reason for that momentarily. So the first step in the evidence-based practice process is to formulate an answerable clinical question. And from there, we search for evidence, we critically appraise the evidence, we determine which intervention is most appropriate, we apply the chosen intervention, and finally, we evaluate practice decisions and provide feedback. Now, one thing I want to say is that the same is true for both of these processes. Yes, they each have their steps, but it's not necessarily a linear process. For example, we might not wait, or it might not be appropriate to wait until the very end to evaluate the interventions that we've applied and provide feedback. It might be more appropriate, depending on the client, to engage in some evaluation of the intervention along the way, right? So yes, step 6 is evaluating and providing feedback, but we really have to take it on a case-by-case basis and understand this process, not so much as linear, but very fluid, okay? And so I'm presenting it in this way, but I just want you to keep in mind that it's not necessarily a linear process. And that's not the case for the evidence-based practice process or the scientific method. They are both very fluid processes, okay? And so the reason why I like to refer to the evidence-based practice process as more of a consumer model is because we are not necessarily producing or conducting research in this process. What we are doing is we are drawing upon the evidence that has been generated by others, okay? And so we're critically appraising that evidence, and we're making some decisions about what is most appropriate to apply in practice with our clients. So we are being consumers of research when we are applying the evidence-based practice model, okay? Now let's talk about the scientific method or the social work research process. Now notice that both processes begin with a question, and that's really what research is it's asking questions and seeking answers to those questions. And so in the scientific method, we ask a question, right? And then we do background research. Okay, and so here again, I want to point out that this is a fluid process because although we might ask a question, once we've done our background research, we might find that we need to adjust our question, right? And so it's not that we do our background research and we just move on to the next step. We might need to go back to step 1 again and ask the question in a different way, because ultimately what we're trying to do is generate new knowledge. We're trying to build on the knowledge that others have produced, and we're looking for where the gaps are in literature. Where can we contribute, right? Where is it that someone else has left off that we can then pick up? Because we're trying to build knowledge, and a part of the knowledge building process is understanding what others have done and where what it is that we want to do fits into the bigger picture, okay? So that literature review or that background research, even though it can be tedious, is a very important step in the process. So we do our background research, we construct a hypothesis, and the hypothesis, just as we learn in grade school, is it's an educated guess, right? It's an informed guess. And so whatever the hypothesis is that we construct is based on the background research that we've already conducted. The background research that we conduct informs our hypothesis, okay? And so once we have constructed our hypothesis, then we test our hypothesis through experimentation. So whether that is through a survey, through an interview, through some type of experiment or intervention, we test our hypothesis through experimentation. And then we analyze our data and we draw conclusions. And once we've drawn the conclusions, then we write up our results. So as you can see, there are both 6 steps in the scientific method as well, and it is also its own process. And I like to refer to the scientific method as more of a producer model because we're actually producing research in the scientific method. We're generating a question, we're generating a hypothesis, we're testing the hypothesis, we're analyzing the data. So we're actually producing the research ourselves in the scientific method, okay? So the EBP process is more about consuming the research of others, and the scientific method is more about producing the research ourselves. So that's the difference. And then as well as we just learned, both start with a question, right? So that's a similarity, okay? And so we want to take into consideration the similarities between the two processes as well as the nuances or the differences as well. And so for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to focus on the evidence-based practice process. And then we'll talk about a couple of other topics, and then we'll move into the scientific method or the social work research process. And so I'll definitely cue each of you when we are moving to the scientific method so that you can follow along and understand where we are in the process, because we're going to talk about how do you formulate a problem? How do you ask a good research question? How do you formulate sound hypotheses? So we'll talk about all of that as we move through the process. And there's a visual that I like to use that I'll share with you that will keep us on target with where we are, because there are so many steps involved that it's important to always make sure that we're navigating through and everyone's following along with where we are in the process. And so when we get to that point, I'll definitely let you know and cue you. But right now, just for the purposes of this discussion, we're talking about the evidence-based practice process, which is a consumer model. So now let's talk about what is evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice is a 6-step process in which practitioners make practice decisions in light of the best research evidence available. Specifically, it encourages practitioners to integrate research with 1, their practice experience, 2, the characteristics of the client or target population, and 3, environmental and organizational constraints bearing on practice decisions. And I really like this definition because it really highlights the importance of understanding that when we're applying the evidence-based practice process, it's not just about the research evidence that we find. It's so much more than that, right? That we're needing to take into consideration. It's our own practice expertise or our practice wisdom, which also matters. It's also the characteristics of the client or target population. So in other words, what are their needs? What are their values? What are their preferences, right? And so this really speaks to our social work core values, and specifically as it relates to the client's right to determination. So we never want to put any research evidence above what our client prefers or whatever our client values, right? So we still have to take into consideration the characteristics of our client. And then finally, we always have to keep in mind that we are functioning within an environmental and organizational context that has certain constraints that might make what it is that we're trying to do maybe not so feasible, right? So we always have to think about feasibility and whether what it is that we're proposing to do is actually going to work given our environmental and organizational context, okay? Because those things also bear on our practice decisions. So I think it's very important. So much when we talk about EBP, we put so much emphasis a lot of the time on the research. And yes, the research is important, but it's more than that, right? So this idea of EBP is broader than just research evidence, okay? And so that's the reason why I think it's important to really discuss the fact that research informs practice decisions, but it doesn't necessarily dictate them. Okay, so broader environmental forces and organizational context can also influence the acceptability and feasibility of our practice decisions. Okay, so we have to keep all of those things in mind. So that's the reason why I really like this visual, because it helps to make this point, is that we're not only talking about, again, we're not just talking about the best available research evidence, but also our clients' needs and preferences, and our practice wisdom or expertise can be seen as a resource, right? And so we don't want to deny that either, or sort of dismiss our practice wisdom, because that does matter. And that's also a part of the equation in terms of how we go about making decisions. And so that's a part of it too. And so, and then within this broader context is our environmental and organizational constraints. So again, keeping all of that in mind as we think about EBP. And now let's talk about EBP in comparison to tradition and authority. So in chapter 1, we talked about the difference between these two concepts. And so we talked about tradition in terms of it being shared meaning and understanding, or an inherited body of knowledge. So a lot of times when we walk into a new agency context or we get a new job, we're really walking, in many instances, we're walking into an inherited body of knowledge, whether we realize it or not. And oftentimes we hear folks say, well, it's always been done this way, right? Or this is just the way things are, right? And so that's really tradition speaking. Or we might find that there's a certain knowledge base that is accepted based on the status or power of the messenger. So in other words, well, our boss or my boss said that it must be done this way, right? And so that's more authority speaking. And so we know in contrast to that, that we have evidence-based practice, which is knowledge accepted in light of the best research evidence available. And so I think it's important to contrast these different ways of knowing to really understand what we're up against. I always like to give students a very realistic picture of what our attempts to apply EBP in practice can look like, because oftentimes it's much easier said than done, right? And so trying to apply EBP in practice can sometimes be an uphill battle. And so we have to know that we're up against things like tradition, authority, and all of these other ways of knowing that are always going to be present in every agency context. So now let's talk a little bit about EBP and critical thinking. So rather than automatically accepting everything others with more experience or authority tell them about their practice, practitioners engaged in EBP question things, okay? So in order to be an evidence-based practitioner, you must be comfortable with questioning things, okay? Rather than conform blindly to tradition or authority, they will take into account the best scientific research evidence available in deciding how to intervene at macro and micro levels. And as we just talked about, in addition to the best scientific research evidence, we're also taking into consideration all of those other things that we just spoke about, okay? And so doing this and really being an evidence-based practitioner in a nutshell requires one to think critically and to question the things that have always been done in a particular way, right? So asking questions about, why is it that things have been done in this way? And do we really know that this is the most effective way to go about doing it? So it has to be sort of that voice of reason and that devil's advocate in many situations when it comes to carrying out this whole notion of evidence-based practice. So in terms of the characteristics of a critical thinker, critical thinkers do the following. They think for themselves. They consider whether beliefs or assertions of knowledge are based on sound evidence and logic. They think open-mindedly, recognizing and questioning unstated assumptions, underlying beliefs and assertions. And I really underscore this unstated assumptions because they're, in many ways within agency context, there are just certain things that happen or ways in which things are carried out that are just unspoken and oftentimes taken for granted. Okay, so we have to think open-mindedly. We have to think about things that are obvious and then things that are not so obvious. Okay, we also have to be willing to test our own beliefs or conclusions and then alter them on the basis of new experiences and evidence. And I think this point is really critical because oftentimes it's much easier to question the beliefs or conclusions of others than it is to question our own beliefs that we hold so dear, okay? And so being a critical thinker means not just being skeptical of other people's conclusions, but skeptical of our own, right? And then, what do you do when you learn something new that sort of flies in the face of what you thought to be true? What do you do, right? So we have to be willing to alter what we think we know when we have new experiences or we receive new evidence that may be to the contrary. Okay, so we have to be open to that as well. And then finally, formulating appropriate questions and then gathering and appraising evidence as a basis for making decisions. Now let's discuss EBP and career-long learning. So evidence-based knowledge is subject to change as newer and perhaps better studies emerge. Thus, being an evidence-based practitioner implies engaging in career-long learning. It means recognizing the need to consistently search for and appraise new evidence as an ongoing part of one's practice. Okay, so it's important to understand that being a social worker doesn't necessarily mean that we arrive at this place of being proficient or in or sort of mastering the evidence-based practice process. We are never in a place where we can genuinely say that, okay? We're always engaging in the learning process. We're always examining new evidence as it emerges. It's an ongoing part of our practice that as so long as we're social workers, that we must be engaged in. And so to that point, I want to share with you a study that I'm currently conducting alongside a couple of faculty members in our school, in the Garland School. One is Dr. Danielle Parrish, who is a faculty member at our Houston campus. And this is actually a study that was done by Dr. Parrish, and she's given me the opportunity to take part in it. And then also Dr. Holly Oxhandler is a part of this work as well. And so the title of this study is called How Easy Is It? Barriers and Facilitators to Evidence-Based Practice in Social Work. And so the population in this study is master level social workers. So these are social workers that have achieved their master's degree and are out in the field practicing, and most of them have some level of licensure, whether it's the LMSW or the LCSW. And so that is our population in this study. And so one of the questions that we asked and one of the relationships that we looked at was, we looked at the relationship between the courses taken as a student, or the number of courses taken as a student, and the perceived difficulty with the use of evidence-based, of the EBP process in practice, okay? So let me rephrase that. So what is the association or relationship between how many courses an individual has taken as a student and how they perceive the difficulty with the use of EBP in their practice? And what we found is that it is only after taking 3 or more courses as a student that we saw a decrease in perceived difficulty with the use of EBP in practice. So in other words, 1 or 2 courses taken as a student is not enough. So even this course that you're taking with me won't necessarily be enough for you to perceive the use of EBP with ease, okay? Or to actually implement EBP with ease, okay? And so this really makes the case for the need for continuing education or for lifelong learning, is that the more courses you take, the less likely you are to perceive the process as difficult, okay? And then the second thing that we looked at is continuing education. So post-masters, what is the relationship between continuing education, or those courses that folks have taken post their master's degree, and difficulty with use of EBP? And so we found a similar relationship, because in the first question, we looked at courses taken as a student. And then now in this question, we're looking at courses taken post-masters, okay? But still finding a similar thing in that as the number of courses increased, the perceived difficulty with the use of EBP decreased. So here again, the same case for the importance of continuing education is that the more courses you take in EBP, the less you are to perceive the process as difficult, okay? And so we really have to emphasize the importance of continued exposure to this kind of content in order to allow for feeling more confident and for perceiving the process as less difficult. So now let's talk about steps in the EBP process. So here are all 6 steps in the process. And again, I want to emphasize that this process is not necessarily linear, okay? For the purposes of this conversation, we're talking about it in this very linear way, but I want to remind you that it is also a very fluid process, okay? So we're going to talk about step 1, which involves formulating a question to answer practice needs. And then we're going to talk about step 2, which involves searching for evidence. So the first step in the EBP process involves formulating a well-built, answerable clinical question that is relevant to a practice decision you must make. Though there are different types of EBP questions, much of the literature focuses on questions about the effectiveness of programs, policies, or interventions. However, this semester, we will focus on the effectiveness of interventions. So the method that I like to use with students, and I find that it's always helpful to provide some kind of structure for developing clinical questions. And so the structure that I use, and it's a very popular structure that's out there on the web, that you can find tons of information on PICO, on the PICO method. Okay, and so this is just a method for developing answerable practice questions. And so in PICO, the P stands for population, the I stands for intervention, the C stands for comparison, and the O stands for outcome. So the PICO method is a technique used in evidence-based practice to formulate and answer a practice question. It is also used to develop and plan a literature search. And so we'll look momentarily at how we go from formulating our question to developing a strategy for searching the literature. And so here again, we have each of the components of the acronym PICO. And also note that a comparison intervention is not always necessary. And so momentarily we'll look at an example where we'll see one example that has a comparison intervention and one that does not. So just keep that in mind, that there may not always be a C in our question, okay? So here's an example. You are a clinician at a mental health clinic in Waco. You work with sexually abused girls ages 5 to 8 experiencing PTSD. Your agency tradition is to provide non-directive play therapy as the primary intervention for every girl. Now, underscore this notion of agency tradition, right? So we might say, let's really take a closer look at this tradition, right? To see if this is really the most effective way to address this problem. There might be another way, okay? And so in our first question, there's no comparison. Let's just say that we want to do a search to see what exactly is the effectiveness of this non-directive play therapy. We're not necessarily trying to compare it to another intervention, but we just want to see what's out there as it relates to this, the effectiveness of this agency tradition of applying this non-directive play therapy, to even see whether it has any merit at all, right? So the first question might be, among sexually abused girls ages 5 to 8, is non-directive play therapy effective in reducing PTSD? Okay, so in this first question, it'll just tell us something about the effectiveness of non-directive play therapy with this particular population. Now, if we wanted to compare the non-directive play therapy to maybe some other modality or treatment, then we would formulate the question in this way. Among sexually abused girls ages 5 to 8, is non-directive play therapy in comparison to talk therapy effective in reducing PTSD? So in this question, there is a C, right? So our C in our PICO is comparison. So in this particular question, there is a comparison, okay? Our comparison is talk therapy. So in this sense, it broadens our question and it allows us to compare one treatment modality to another, okay? And so both are considered PICO questions. Even though the first one, our question 1, does not have a comparison, it's still a PICO question, okay? And so these are just 2 examples, one with a comparison intervention and one without a comparison intervention. So once we have formulated our PICO question, now we are ready to search for evidence. So before we get into the particulars of how to search the literature, I want to talk a little bit about 2 approaches to searching for evidence, and this is covered in your text. So the first is a bottom-up search, and this approach involves starting from scratch and examining single studies one by one, okay? And then a top-down search in comparison is that instead of starting from scratch, in this approach, you rely on the results of evidence-based searches that others have done. These searches result in a report that compiles the findings of several studies together into one document. Okay, so this is what we would call a systematic review or meta-analysis, what I refer to as studies of studies. Okay, so in bottom-up searches, we're looking for studies one by one. Okay, in top-down searches, we're looking for studies that have pooled a number of other studies together into one study. Okay, there are some advantages and disadvantages to each approach. So for bottom-up searches, the disadvantage is that it is more tedious, right? So looking for one study at a time, study by study, can be very time-consuming. The advantage is that you get to determine where the patterns are. So you're not necessarily relying on anyone else, because in top-down searches, they can be biased, right? How does one go about deciding which studies they're going to include in their systematic review or meta-analysis and which ones they don't? They can potentially leave out certain studies that you would deem as important, right? And so that's the disadvantage to, or rather the advantage to bottom-up searches, is that you handpick the studies yourself, right? You're not relying on anyone else's search process or the integrity of their search process, because we don't know that, right? We don't really necessarily know the integrity with which someone has completed their search. And so by us doing our own bottom-up search, it allows us to pull the evidence in the way that we see fit, rather than relying on someone else. Now, the benefit of a top-down search is that it saves us some time, right? So if we can find a good systematic review or meta-analysis, that can save us a lot of time in terms of really kind of getting a lay of the land and just seeing kind of and it has all the information about a number of studies in one place. And so for obvious reasons, that can be very convenient, and it can save us a ton of time, especially being very busy in practice and not having a lot of time to do bottom-up searches. Top-down searches can save us a great deal of time and can be very useful. But again, the disadvantage is that you're relying on the integrity of someone else's search process. And you're trusting them in a sense to give you the most valid information and to really be inclusive in terms of the studies that they utilize in their systematic review and meta-analysis. And so we just never know, even though it is the responsibility of the researcher in the systematic review or meta-analysis to tell us what their search process was, how they went about finding studies, what the keywords were that they use. I mean, they do have, there are some criteria that folks who are writing these systematic reviews and meta-analyses must follow. But again, we're putting a lot of trust in that person, and we just don't know whether they're leaving out certain studies that we need to take into consideration. And so that's really the disadvantage of top-down searches. But again, as I mentioned, there are some advantages as well. And so in terms of best practice, I always like to encourage students to employ both approaches, right? And so oftentimes you might begin with a top-down search where you are just looking at and reading through literature reviews, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses, just to give you a lay of the land and just to provide a foundation. And then from there, what you might do is look at the reference list that's within those review studies, just to see what are the individual studies that they included. And then you might do a search for those individual studies, right? And so then you can kind of get a sense and see for yourself what each individual study had to say. And so using a top-down approach can be a good starting point, because it really kind of gives you a synopsis and a lay of the land of whatever the problem is that you're trying to better understand, or whatever the intervention is that you're trying to better understand. But I wouldn't stop there. I would continue and I would look for individual studies as well to supplement whatever review studies that I might be looking at, okay? And so really it's good to do both, top-down and bottom-up searches. And so I just want to reiterate, just to make sure that, that all is clear as it relates to the difference between single research studies versus studies of studies. And so again, studies of studies is basically where we are looking at individual studies or the authors of the meta-analysis or systematic review are looking at individual studies, and they are pooling the results of those studies together into one report that is referred to as a meta-analysis or a systematic review. And this is in contrast to single research studies, right? So we're just looking at individual studies, study 1, study 2, study 3 separately, right? And so this is what you'll be doing for your article review critique panel presentations, is that each of you in your respective groups will be pulling single studies, and it will be up to you all to synthesize those studies. And the benefit of that is that you get to do the intellectual work of finding where the patterns are, right? Because that's really what it is. It's an intellectual endeavor to read a bunch of different studies and really discern whatever the patterns are across those studies. And what you discern may be different than what someone else discerns. But at the end of the day, you are doing the intellectual exercise yourself of finding the synthesis among all of those studies and determining where those patterns are. And so when we look at studies of studies, I just want to describe or explain the difference between systematic reviews and meta-analyses, because I don't want to assume that you all understand the difference. And so a systematic review is a report on the results of comprehensive searches for unpublished and published studies that address a particular practice question. And I want to say here, even though your text says unpublished studies, I personally would not include any unpublished studies in a systematic review. I would only include published and peer-reviewed studies, okay? And so essentially it is a comprehensive search, and once we have done that comprehensive search and we have really looked at the results across all of those studies, then we generate conclusions about which interventions have been most and least effective in alleviating a problem. Now, this is in contrast to meta-analyses. Meta-analyses are a type of systematic review that pools the statistical results across studies of particular interventions. Meta-analyses generate conclusions about which interventions have the strongest impact on treatment outcomes, okay? And so meta-analyses are considered to be a stronger form of evidence in compared to systematic reviews, simply because we're not just talking about patterns across studies, but we're talking about what are the statistical findings, what are the statistical results, and how do those statistical results bear out across a number of studies, right? And so when we're able to look at the statistical results and how they bear out across studies, that allows us to speak to not just what is most and least effective, but also what has the strongest impact on treatment outcomes. And so that's a different level of knowledge, okay? And so meta-analyses are considered to be a stronger form of evidence for that reason. And so here we are, we have the hierarchy of evidence. Okay, and so we see that meta-analysis is at the very top, followed by systematic reviews. Okay, so when we look at the hierarchy of evidence, we see that studies of studies are at the top of the hierarchy. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that they are without their flaws, right? So we still have to critically appraise meta-analyses and systematic reviews, even though they're considered to be stronger forms of evidence in comparison to other types of studies. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're perfect. Right? And so there are criteria by which we evaluate these types of studies as well, just like any other study. Okay, and so this is just a note about that in terms of the fact that all forms of evidence found in the search process must be critically appraised before applied in practice, even meta-analyses and systematic reviews. And so here's some of the criteria for critically appraising systematic reviews and meta-analyses. And I won't read through all of these, but I do just want to put these before you so that you understand that there are criteria, okay, for critically appraising these types of studies. And one of the most important things about these types of studies is transparency. And transparency is actually one of the principles of the scientific method. And so one of the most important things that authors of these types of studies must do is they must tell the reader what their search process was. And they must be very clear about that process in terms of what databases they use, what key search terms they use. All of these things should be very clearly spelled out in a systematic review or meta-analysis. So much so that it would allow us to retrace those steps if we really wanted to, okay? So that's one thing definitely to look for in these types of studies, among other things. So we've talked about studies of studies. So now let's talk about individual studies, okay? And so the kind of individual studies that we're going to talk about are experimental studies. So one type of experimental study is called a randomized control trial, or an RCT. An RCT is an experimental study in which people are randomly assigned to a treatment group or a control group in order to attest the effectiveness of a treatment or intervention, okay? And so they're randomly assigned. So we have two groups of individuals that are randomly assigned. They're either placed in a treatment group or a control group. And the control group is the group that typically does not get treatment. And so we're comparing those that receive the treatment or intervention to those that do not. And we're looking to see how effective that treatment or intervention is. And then we have the quasi-experimental study. So a quasi-experimental study is an experimental study designed also with the same purpose, which is to test the effectiveness of a treatment or intervention. However, in this type of study, this is done without random assignment, okay? And so there are certain circumstances in which within our agency context, we may not be able to engage in random assignment. There may be some constraint or some reason why we cannot randomly assign. And so when that's not possible, then we use a quasi-experimental design, okay? And so we'll talk about the difference. We have a whole chapter dedicated to experimental design and a whole another chapter dedicated to quasi-experimental designs. And so we will talk about this in great detail when we get to unit number 4, which is related to designs for evaluating programs in practice. But I'm just touching on this briefly here now so that you can understand the differences between studies of studies and single studies. And so when we look at our hierarchy of evidence, we see that experimental studies fall a little bit lower on the hierarchy. So we have randomized controlled trials followed by quasi-experimental studies. And so the reason for this is that obviously when we're talking about meta-analyses which pool the statistical results of a number of studies together, it's clear why this will be a stronger form of evidence than a single study such as a randomized control trial or a quasi-experimental study that really only tells us about one study, right? So of course, if there's a study that tells us about multiple studies and brings the results of all of those studies together, that will be a much stronger form of evidence in that case, okay? And so hence the reason why we see that meta-analyses are at the top of the hierarchy, followed by systematic reviews, followed by randomized control trials, and then quasi-experimental studies. So when we think about critically appraising research evidence and how we know what is considered a quality form of evidence or not, we really want to refer to our hierarchy of evidence. Keeping in mind that, yes, this is a hierarchy, and yes, this gives us some guidance, but we still need to critically appraise each study within itself. Now let's talk a little bit about the search process. So before searching for evidence, you must plan a literature search strategy. This helps to narrow the focus of your search. Planning a strategy requires identifying the major elements of the question and translating those elements into database language using keyword search terms and Boolean operators. So let's say, for example, the major elements of our PICO question or the components, let's say that our population is physically abused children, our intervention is trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. We don't necessarily have a comparison group, but our outcome is PTSD. Our keyword search terms and Boolean operators might be something like trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and PTSD and physically abused children and systematic review. Okay, so we might include all of these terms in our search. Okay, but you can see how we use the elements of the PICO question to then formulate our search strategy. And so here's an example of Boolean operators. So oftentimes students don't really take this into consideration in terms of thinking about how to go about searching in the most effective way. But we can use words in our search like and, or, and not, okay, to help us to pull out or to allow for our results, our search rather, to turn up those studies that we really want. Okay, and so as you can see here in my question, I use the word and a lot, right? So I use trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and PTSD and et cetera, right? And so I use that word and a lot, but depending on how I want to search, I can also use the word or, which means give me this or that, right? And then I can also use the word not, give me this, not that, right? And so these are ways that we can go about speaking to the database that we're using. So in other words, we're using these Boolean operators to talk to the database that we're using in a way that it understands, because all databases are built on these Boolean operators, and we can't necessarily see these things as almost like a black hole, right? It's like when we're doing this search, we're looking into this black hole that we can't necessarily see. And so using this Boolean operator language helps us to talk to the database in a more effective way. And so in EBSCOhost, this is what it looks like, right? And so we see here, this is the place where we put in our Boolean operators here, where it says and, right? And so when we click on this down arrow, we'll also see the words or and not here, okay? So in here as well. And then we also wanna make sure that we click on the word full text, and that we also click on scholarly and peer-reviewed journals. And so here's our PICO question, right? And so, for example, going back to the question that we just talked about, our question might be, among children who have experienced physical abuse, is trauma-focused CBT effective in reducing PTSD? Okay, so this might be our PICO question. And so for each of the concepts in our question, we want to think about synonyms or related terms. So in other words, because sometimes when we're not pulling the information that we want, sometimes it's because we're not using the right words. Okay, so we might think about the concept of physical abuse. Well, what's another term for physical abuse? We might say maltreatment or just abuse, right? And then also, what's another word for children? Well, we might just say child or youth. Or another term we could use for PTSD is psychopathology, okay? Or trauma-focused CBT. We might say trauma-informed CBT or trauma-related CBT. So we want to be flexible with the terms that we use in our search. For each of the concepts in your question, again, you want to think about the synonyms or related terms, and you also want to use the literature to guide you in the process. And what I mean by this is that once you start to pull studies related to your topic, if you spend some time maybe reading one or two studies in that area, you can get a sense of what is the discipline-specific jargon that's being used. And that'll give you an idea of how you might tweak your search so that you can be consistent with the terminology that's actually being used in the body of literature that you're trying to tap into, okay? So we want to think about the concepts and then also some synonyms or related terms that can help us to yield the information that we ultimately want. And so here's just a map that I like to share with students in terms of how you can think about combining each concept with the Boolean operators. And so this can often help in the search process. And so if you want to do something like this for yourself, you can sort of track. So with each search that you do, you can track all the concepts that you're using. And so that way, when you go back to search again, you're not using the same words, or you can remember what words you have used, okay? So that you can continue to generate sort of a vocabulary or a glossary, so to speak, of terms that you can draw on in your search process. And so some considerations in the search for evidence. Sometimes evidence will be inconclusive or mixed, with some studies implying one course of action and other studies implying another. And so sometimes when we conduct searches, we think everybody's going to be speaking the same language. And sometimes that's not the case, right? So one researcher might find one thing and another researcher might find something different, right? And so if we look at the literature as sort of like one big conversation, then we can understand and begin to see the pattern. So it's not really about everyone finding the same thing. That's the beauty of research. And that's where we begin to see the patterns is that we understand that sometimes findings can be inconclusive. And what that means is that we need to do more research in that area in order to build a greater sense of cohesiveness within a particular body of literature. So we have to be prepared for that it might not, what we find might not all point in the same direction. In addition, some evidence will indicate what actions not to take, right? Rather than what actions to take. And so a lot of times when we're looking into the literature, we're looking for the literature to speak to us and to talk to us and tell us what to do. But sometimes it will tell us what not to do. And that's just as important, right? And also evidence will point toward taking an action that the client does not want. And so this is what goes back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of always keeping the needs and preferences and values of the client at the forefront. And it goes back to our core values of the client's right to self-determination. And so even if the research suggests that a particular modality or treatment is effective, it may be something that the client's not comfortable with or doesn't want for some reason. And so we have to keep that in mind as well. Sometimes the evidence will be applicable to some clients, groups, situations, or contexts and not others. And so we really want to examine the studies that we're reading, and we want to really get an understanding of and discern who the client, who the individuals are that are involved in the study, and in what context was that intervention delivered? Because the context in which that intervention is delivered might not match our context, or it might not be feasible in our context. So we really have to get an understanding of not just the sample or who was included in the study or maybe even who was excluded, right? So we want to think about who was included in the study as well as who was excluded. And then we also want to think about context. Okay, so that's something to also take into consideration. Overall, these considerations underscore the client-centered nature of EBP and the importance of evaluating practice decisions, okay? And so even though we stress the importance of research in the EBP process, the client is really at the center of it. And we want to keep that in mind. And we want to also keep in mind that we always need to be evaluating. And so earlier I said that we're talking about EBP as a process that has 6 steps that sort of appear to be in this very linear order, but we have to keep in mind and know that it's a fluid process. And so just because we have already implemented an intervention with the client doesn't mean that we keep going, right? We have to evaluate. So that might mean evaluating midway through rather than at the very end. That might mean evaluating midway to see how it's working. And if it's not working, stopping, right? And if it is working, continuing, okay? And so where that evaluation and feedback step comes in can vary from client to client, even though the process says that it's step 6, right? Yes, that is true, but we want to keep in mind the fluid nature of this process. I really want to stress that. And so here's some free resources for finding evidence. So of course we have Baylor Library, but even beyond Baylor Library, so post-graduation, once you complete the program here at Baylor, here's some other free resources such as the Corcoran collaboration, the Campbell collaboration, and then also always Google Scholar. Okay, and so these are some free resources that you can tap into even beyond your time at Baylor. And so in summary, in this video lecture, we have discussed chapter 2, which is related to evidence-based practice. We've talked about the EBP process in comparison to the scientific method or the social work research process. We've talked about what is EBP, or we've discussed a working definition for the concept. We also talked about EBP in relation to being a critical thinker. We've also talked about EBP in relation to being a career-long learner. And finally, we've talked about the first 2 steps in the EBP process, which is formulating an answerable practice question and searching for evidence. So in the next video lecture, we will discuss the final 3 steps in the evidence-based practice process, which includes critically appraising the relevant studies you find, determining which research-supported intervention is most appropriate for your particular client, applying the chosen intervention, and finally, providing feedback, evaluation, and feedback. Now is the point at which I invite you to check for your understanding of these concepts. You can do this in one of three ways. One is to complete the form on the left and click submit, or you might copy and paste the link on the right into your browser, or scan the QR code with your cell phone. I hope that this has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next class.